All of us have seasons or events or situations in which we come upon a place and there's decisions to be made. Decisions, some of them are decisions that we don't want to go forward. We look out and we think, oh, that landscape is too scary. I don't want to go there. It's going to take too much effort for me to try to get to where that is leading. And so we stand where we are. We look back and we think it's so much easier if we just are content, complacent. Because if we stay where we are and not cross over, it means that we don't have to change anything about our lives. That we know our tribe, we know our people. We don't have to let anybody else in. If we stay where we are, it means we don't have to change anything, that we want everything the way it's always been. We're going to cling to it, and it's easier that way. And so as we look over and we get pushed to that edge, we make a decision. And then some of us, we look at the edge and oh my goodness, it looks hard going forward. It feels heavy. We don't understand the landscape. We actually don't really have a map. We have a compass, but we don't really have a map. And we think that next step, if I cross and leave where I am, it's too far. That's a lot of scariness right there that I'm unsure that's going to hold me. Is it going to be good for me? And yet there's something about that also comes in saying, if I take that step, I'm going to be different today than I was yesterday. And in both situations, there's fear, there's uncertainty, there's the unknowing. And yet, when we take that step, when we cross over that threshold, when we take that step that says, I want to be different than what I am today, something happens and there's a vulnerability that comes. There's a vulnerability that comes in saying, I want to be seen. I want to be heard. I want to be understood. And yet I'm going to trust the very thing that I cannot see. And I'm going to pour all of my energy into the people, into the places, into the events that are coming my way that I don't understand or I don't have a map for. All of us in this room, and I'm not talking about transitions, I'm talking about the thresholds of our lives. The places where we've made conscious sometimes or unconscious decisions to stay or to go, to cling to that which we know or to move forward. And every single one of us in every single movement, we're clinging to those decisions because we want to be seen. We want to be valued. We want a blessing. Well, Simeon has waited literally a lifetime. And on this day, he finds himself, it was not expected. He makes his way to the temple like he's done 1,000 times before. He makes his way to the temple because it's his job. It's what he does. It's who he is and all that God has called him to be. And he makes his way to the temple because God has given him a promise. When Simeon was young and full of energy, God said to Simeon, "Hey, Simeon, you're not going to leave this life until you meet the one." And so every day, Simeon would get up and do what God had called him to do. And on this day, he makes his way to the temple. And Anna's with him, and maybe it was a Sunday like today where there wasn't much going on, or a day like today where they just traveled together. And he's in the temple. And this couple comes through the door, not in pomp and circumstance, not blaring who they are. No, they enter the temple almost as if they're shy. They enter the temple not being named. And Simeon and Anna look up. And when they look up, they find themselves at a threshold. They find themselves at the threshold of new beginnings and yet hardships, at sacrifices yet the restoration, at a resurrection and yet a death. And all of that comes in just a swoop of a minute. And they see the parents, and they know that those parents are at a threshold. They know that those parents are at the threshold of holding their baby so tightly and yet letting go and letting the world have Jesus. Of wanting to protect him and wanting to stand by him, but knowing that they will let him walk away. Of wanting to shelter him and yet knowing that the world is going to call him out. All of them stand at a different kind of threshold because Simeon understands that in this moment, as his eyes have seen the one he's been waiting for, that the one that's entered the temple today is going to be the one that at a young age stands behind a colonnade in the temple, trying to find that spot and starts talking, and as he talks, he will be mocked. Simeon knows that the one that's before him is the one that's going to flip over tables and flip this world upside down and going to press up against every rule they've ever known, every tradition they've ever held onto, that Jesus will come and flip those upside down. And he knows, he can see that in the humbleness and the meekness that arrives today in the temple, that there's going to be a day where there are shouts and trumpets and then words. He knows that the one that has entered is on the threshold of welcoming everybody in, of tearing down the walls and saying, I cannot be contained in these walls, in these traditions, in these ways of how we've always done it, but that Jesus will make a new way. And so Simeon catches his breath as he stands on that threshold, knowing that in the threshold, and the threshold for him is not life, but death. This threshold that once he crosses over it, once he reaches out his hand, that his own days are numbered. And the death of being on this earth is coming, but the life of being with God is just beginning. And so Simeon and Anna, I can only imagine, both looked at each other. Both looked around the temple and thought, oh my goodness, my days are numbered. And they held their breath and they stood at the cusp of the threshold. And they did something that we all hope to do. They took a step forward. And they took a step forward and they crossed the threshold. And they didn't just cross the threshold. You know what they did? They reached out for baby Jesus. They reached out for the infant to bring him into their lives, to make room for God in their lives in a new way. And as they reached out, Simeon does something that he's probably done a gazillion times, but this time it's different. Because he sees and understands and recognizes what Mary and Joseph are going through. He gives it the space. And as he's holding on to the baby, Simeon blesses. He literally blesses Jesus. He calls out the salvation. He calls forth the restoration. And he gives thanks that the salvation is coming, not just for he and Anna, but for every single person, named and unnamed. You see, blessings are not just words. Blessings, what Simeon did with Jesus, it's this thin line. It's the thin line that happens when you lean into wisdom, when you lean into the invisible, when you trust that in which you cannot see. And when you gently touch somebody and you acknowledge all that they are feeling, all that they have felt, and you claim goodness and forgiveness and resurrection upon them, so that the next step of the journey, so that when there comes a time to cross the threshold, they might have the courage to cross over. To stop clinging to the past, but to hang on to the future. To hang tight and to follow where they don't have a map. Today, God gives us. He sees and acknowledges every single one of us. And as customary, we've entered the temple. And today, God is reaching out and pouring the wisdom, the intimacy, and the intuition into our lives and saying, I see you, I honor you, and I love you. Come. Come into the new life to be restored. Come and trust me. And he blesses every single one of us in this room. And for that, we give thanks. Let us pray.